It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Darin Self. Professor Self is new to BYU. He is in the Department of Political Science. He is also a Kennedy Faculty Research Fellow this semester, and is a recipient of a Kennedy Center Research Fellowship that we give to both professors and to students on the topic of our lecture series each semester. Dr. Self's research is focused on the development of democracy, and when you talk to him about democracy and issues of quality of democracy, his face lights up. He gets very excited. This is a topic that I also enjoy a great deal because democracy is very complicated, and the relationship between authoritarianism and democratization and the way that authoritarian legacies shape democracies is a key focus of Professor Self's research. He has done research in Asia as well as in South America, and thinks about questions of democracy around the world. His topic today is the challenges of building democracy after military rule. Professor Self will speak to us until about 12:40, 12:45, at which point we will move to a discussion and invite your questions at that point, and we will finish today at 1 o'clock. Please join me in welcoming Professor Self.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and talk to you about my research. First off, I just want to thank Professor Monson and the Kennedy Center for their support. This project started when I was in graduate school, and with their support, I'm able to hopefully bring this to a full fruition and publish it in a book in the upcoming year. So just as some background in my research, when people think about authoritarian regimes, a lot of times they imagine tanks on the street, right, or soldiers parading down the street. And so we have this vision of what an authoritarian regime that often includes the military. But a lot of times we don't think about how authoritarianism ends and what the military does at the end, right? So in this picture, it's a picture from Greece in the 60s. So the military there took power through a junta, or ruled in a junta, and then just a few years later, kind of just washed their hands and walked away, right? Just turned things over to a conservative government. And they're like, we're done. That's cool, right? But that's not how it always works, right? So in South Korea, Park Chung-hee took power through a coup, ruled for over a decade until his assassination. And even after he was assassinated, the military stayed in power. And this was despite years and years of protests in South Korea, right? Like, it was pretty obviously the people did not want to live under military rule, but the military would not relent. And only in the late 80s did they manage a very slow, carefully managed transition to democracy. In some other places, like in Pakistan, what we observe is that the military frequently comes back into power. So they've had a series of coups since partition with India and their independence. And often what this looks like is the military will come to power and rule for several years, and then their exit out of power is a system that they designed themselves. And usually a former general like Musharraf here, who actually just passed away this past weekend, he became president after he had led the junta for several years, and he was president for a long time and only stepped down, I think, when he was satisfied. But in each case, eventually the military gave way to democracy. And then we have Myanmar. So this is one of my favorite gifts. What happened was you have like a jazzercise teacher, right? She's just teaching her class in front of the main square, and I think unbeknownst to her, there is a coup happening in the background, right? So this is a literal coup happening with vehicles from military officials arriving at the Capitol to imprison the Democratic leaders. But hey, let's have some fun while we're doing it, right? But I point out Myanmar because the military there has ruled for most of the time since independence, and they've tried to lead democratization a couple times, but every time they try to do it, they do go through this very constrained system, and eventually abort that with a coup, right? Like they get to a point where they're just unsatisfied with how things are going and then retake power. So my research tries to answer this question of why, in some instances, does the military just give up power and walk away, and why in other cases are they more like the Myanmar military or the Pakistani military, where they take a direct role in designing democracy, right? So some of you in this room, I'm assuming, are not political science majors and you've not taken a class from me, so you should say, why do I care about the military, right? Well, we care about the military, especially as a political actor, because they have played a major role in the political development of many countries throughout the world, right? So this is a graph that looks at the number or the types of authoritarian regimes that existed after the Second World War until recent history. And we can break this down by like, is the regime structured by a party, so like the Communist Party in China? Is this a monarchy like we see in Saudi Arabia? Is it personalist, like we would see with Idi Amin, or is it a military-led regime, right? And we can see with this gray line here that in the heart of in the Cold War, military regimes made up nearly a quarter of all authoritarian regimes, right? So this is not some trivial number of regimes where you just had a couple generals who were power hungry for a little bit and then walked away, right? This affects a huge portion of global politics, right? Also, we should think about the military because they have tanks and guns, right? And so if they want to take a direct role in politics, it's actually pretty easy for them to do so, right? If you are civilians trying to run elections and the military decides to use their coercive force against you, it's really hard to stop them, right? And so we kind of have this eternal dilemma with the military, right? Is how does the military take a place in a democratic society while holding on to this coercive power of being able to use tanks, guns, and airplanes without them inappropriately using that power to violate norms of democracy and democratic development, right? So at the core of my research is understanding what affects the military support for democracy, right? And I'm going to walk you through two cases of military rule that ended up in democracy, but in two very different ways, right? So I'm going to start telling you a story of Paraguay. Not too many people know much about Paraguay. It's in the heart of South America, and it had a large civil war in the 1940s. And during the Civil War, you basically had part of the government that wanted to side with what was called the Colorado Party, and the other side, which were more revolutionary, a revolutionary faction, and then a liberal faction that was trying to band together to oust the Colorado Party from power. And the Colorado Party was actually an exceptionally strong party at this point, right? So they had actually been out of power for several decades. And during those decades, activists within the party spent their time creating what are called, basically known as community centers in every single neighborhood in Paraguay, right? So if you go into Asunción or any city in Paraguay, just walk a couple streets and I guarantee you will run into one of these community centers that is attached to the Colorado Party, right? And so what they were able to do, the Colorado Party, is even though they were in power and the military split at that moment, they were able to use these community centers that were deeply embedded in society to marshal a citizen army, right? These are largely peasant or rural workers, known as Pinani, which is Guarani, I believe, for shoeless, right? So these are shoeless peasants that came and fought for the Colorado Party. And because they were able to marshal this large army, they eventually won power. But even with power, they kind of struggled to hold on to it because there was a lot of infighting within the party. They cycled through several presidents in just a matter of years, and they thought they figured it out and settled on this one president, and he was president for over 5 years. But when it was coming time to be reelected, they found out that he was trying to create an alliance with a specific division within the military to consolidate power for himself. And to prevent that, they ousted him in a coup. But when they did that, they were kind of torn because they could not settle on one candidate to replace him. So what they did is they selected a general from the military named Alfredo Stroessner. Initially, he was meant to just be in there for a few years as kind of like a unity candidate, right? They would just be like, okay, you're going to finish this other president's term, and then we're going to choose a new candidate and replace you. But it turns out that they couldn't find a new candidate that they could agree on, and Alfredo Stroessner ended up ruling Paraguay for 35 years. Yeah, imagine that, right? Like you think that you're going to be just in something for an interim position, and 30 years later, you're still in power, right? So during these 30 years, you basically have this strong alliance between the Colorado Party and the military to stay in power, right? So he is still wearing the uniform of a general, even though he is holding a civilian office as the president. And you can see in this room, some people are in military uniform, other people in more like just official uniforms, right? So you have this coalition between the Colorado Party and the military supporting Alfredo Stroessner in power for these 30 years. But what eventually starts to happen is the Colorado Party, a lot of the strongest members of the party begin to retire, right? So these are the elite members of the party that helped form the party, that made it kind of its core base, and who could constrain Stroessner. But as they begin to retire, what Stroessner does is he begins to pick their replacements with people who are loyal to him. And what this does is over time shifts the balance of power away from the party to him. Right? So as we're entering the 1980s, a lot of the members of the party are what we would call Stroessnistas, right? Or people who support Stroessner. So now he has the party on his side, and his goal to consolidate power then is to make sure that the military is loyal to him, right? Bad idea. He kind of picked a fight that he couldn't win, right? So what he wanted to do was pass laws that force retirement of senior officers, right? And then he could push them out and then replace them with officers that were loyal to him. Obviously, the senior officers frowned upon this, and they launched a coup in coordination with some of the Colorado Party old-timers to oust him, right? So he was ousted in a coup in 1989. And so this is just one of the pictures of one of the tanks on the streets, right? So again, the military directly intervening in politics to remove Stroessner from power. And the party, in order to get the military to do this, what the party did is they promised that they would hand power over to Andres Rodriguez, who is the person on your right, my left here, right? So he was the highest-ranking general in the military under Stroessner. He led the coup. And then on the other side here is we have some of these party elites. These are Colorados who are loyal to the party and not to Stroessner. And so they lead this charge to install Andres Rodriguez into power. Right, but then they're facing the same dilemma that they did 35 years prior, is how do we create a system where the military isn't too powerful, right? And eventually they decided to democratize, and I'll get into that in a little bit, right? But one of the keys here is we want to understand why the military, in this instance, would either share power with civilians or give it up. Right? And so what actually ended up happening, to my surprise, when I was doing interviews, is the military did nothing. They had power, right? They knew that they could stay in power, but when the Colorados were like, actually, we want to democratize, the military said, okay, and turned power over to the Colorados completely. Which was really fascinating because in the Constitution at the time, the military actually had a formal role that it could take in drafting any new constitution. They were a member of the state council, right? So I talked, when I was doing interviews there, with the man who actually drafted the Constitution. And asked him, like, you know, how did generals interact with you? And he said, they didn't do anything, right? Like, they would come and they would sit there and not ask for anything. Instead, what they were able to do is draft an entire new constitution by civilians without the military's influence. And this was striking to me because the military had been involved in politics for over a century in Paraguay, whether you were a Colorado or a liberal, right? So why in early 1990s did the military just step back? And ultimately, what this produced was just a system ran by civilians. So Paraguay today is a healthy-ish democracy, I would say, right? Like, it's not the most robust democracy. The Colorado Party doesn't really play fair. They kind of use their power to make it harder for other people to organize against them. But we would still call it a democracy. without the military involved. And this is one of the key takeaways that we want to see with Paraguay and its democratic development, right? Is how we were able to have a military that was very active and then walk away. And I think one thing that can help us make sense of this is actually comparing Paraguay to Indonesia. Not obvious, right? If I asked you, like, what's a country that you might want to think about explaining to help you explain Paraguay, Indonesia is not going to come to mind. But I will show you how this works, right? So Indonesia also has a very politically active military in its history, right? The military played a huge role in their revolution against Dutch colonial rule in the 1940s, and it actually had developed independent of civilians. So it was its own actor that was often directly involved in politics from 1945 onward, and they really hate communists. One of the reasons why they really hate communists is during the revolution, a member of the civilian government who was a communist left the government and tried to start his own revolution against the revolution, right? So he basically, instead of joining forces to fight against the Dutch, started fighting against the military and revolutionary forces. And so the military, in the middle of fighting the Dutch, had to direct some of their resources to put down this communist rebellion within Indonesia. So they're not fond of communists at all because of that. And they had a very tense relationship going through the 50s and into the 60s. And ultimately what happened was in 1965, the communists, fearing the military becoming too powerful, tried to preempt a military coup with their own coup. And so what they did is they captured 6 of the 7 highest ranking generals in the Indonesian military and assassinated them. As you can imagine, the military did not like that. And they responded very harshly, right? So they came in, they took control, and started to use a lot of coercive force. It's estimated between 500,000 to 1.5 million people were killed in the subsequent years, with the military trying to purge the country of communists, right? So the military, obviously not fond of anything left of center or right wing, but when they come to power, they have a dilemma, right? They don't really want to take control and be rulers, but they don't want to turn things over to civilians because allowing civilians to rule is what got their generals killed, right? So what they do is they create a new doctrine and they decide we're going to stay in power and try to fix this. And one thing that they tried to do in fixing this is they created a political party, right? In interviews with generals and reading a lot of their histories, a lot of times they blamed political parties as the source of all the ails of instability in Indonesia, right? Highly fractured party system, lots of different parties, Islamist parties, leftist parties, Christian parties, and a lot of infighting. And so the military, what they do is like, okay, we're going to create a party, and we're going to create a party system with 3 parties. We're going to have our party, we're going to have an Islamist party, and we're going to have a secular party. That's not affiliated with us, right? You have to vote for one of these 3. And over the 35 years that they're in power, they organize this party and they let it contest in elections. But this party is quite different from the Colorado Party for a couple of reasons. First, it was created by the military, right? So it's this top-down creation, where the Colorado Party was a bottom-up creation of people close to communities, right? So you have the military just building a party, and they just build it basically to run sham elections, right? Like they're not building this party to really represent people and to help develop a democratic society. And so this party, I should say, is named Golkar. It does start to develop, and it becomes a large party, but ultimately, because it was created under authoritarianism, no one has any clue how strong this party is, right? Like if you could switch from the authoritarian regime to the democratic regime, you have no idea how many votes they could win in a free and fair election, right? And the military is very aware of this, right? So they're very reluctant to turn more and more power over to Golkar, but as the regime progresses, Golkar does take a larger role. But all of this comes to a halt in 1998 because of protests that emerged after the Asian financial crisis started. So in 1997, you have the Asian financial crisis, which originates in Thailand and then spreads to a lot of the Southeast Asian countries. And it hits Indonesia very hard, right? You have high inflation and the economy just crashes, which, as you can imagine, would make people upset, right? And see the authoritarian regime as illegitimate, right? They're not effective at government. They're not representing us. Sure, they've been developing for the past 30 years, but they're failing right now. And what eventually happened was these large protests grew so large that they stormed the parliament. And that's what this picture is. This is actually from the top of the parliament building. And what you have is massive student protests spilling into the parliament square, and then they entered into the parliament and just basically occupied it. And at this point, a lot of the leaders of the regime were like, okay, we need to change. I actually interviewed many of the people who were locked in a room during this time, right? And it was unreal to see them say, like, yeah, we were just locked in a room, people were storming the parliament, and we needed to figure out how to solve this situation. I was like, well, how do you do that? And they're like, well, we kick out the dictator, right? Was kind of like their main thing, right? So they publish a notice, basically, that says, Suharto, the dictator, needs to resign, or else we're going to impeach him and begin a transition to democracy. Suharto and the military at first were like, you can't do that, but the protests were so overwhelmingly strong and persistent, and the military kept on, or civilians kept on saying, you need to resign, that eventually Suharto did decide to resign. But unlike in Paraguay, where the military just stepped back and let civilians take control of the transition to democracy, the military in Indonesia took a very direct role. So this is in 1998. In 1999, they hold their first free and fair elections, but at this time, the military still held seats in their parliament and in their legislative leadership, right? And members of their presidency. And so they start this transition to democracy, but the entire time, the military's there. And if civilians try to pass a reform, the military's just like, no, you can't do that one, right? Or if they pass something that the military is fine with, the military says, okay, we will accept that. And you go through this transition for 5 years, where eventually you hold elections in 2004. Oh, sorry, I missed a part there, but we'll just keep on going. You go to 2004, and the military finally decides that it's going to give up all its formal powers in politics and just kind of work behind the scene. And they do this because a former general named Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono runs for president. It's him running for president and another general, Wiranto, running for president against a member of the opposition, right? So the military going into this election knows that 2 generals are running for president, and one of them is likely to win. And he does win. And what happens is that after that point, the military keeps its role in politics, but not kind of at the front, right? So behind the scenes, the military is still very much involved in politics. So we had a former general become president through elections. The current president, Jokowi, a lot of his main right-hand men in the cabinet are all former generals. A lot of high-ranking officials in political parties are former generals. As an example of this, so Golkar, that party that was allied with the military, it's actually one of the largest parties in Indonesia, but they're really reliant on the military for support. They're very friendly with the military, and I was struck by this when I went to interview some of their officials, and I had to interact with their secretary general. So in a political party, you basically have the chairman of the party and then the secretary general, right? So the chairman is kind of like big ideas guy, and the secretary general puts into practice all the business, right? So it's a very important position. And that position was filled by a guy that had retired from the military and immediately from the military went into that position, right? He was not involved in Golkar before that. He was not loyal to Golkar. He didn't serve his time in Golkar, right? He just retired as a high-ranking general, and Golkar is like, okay, now you're going to be our secretary general to keep that alliance with the military strong, right? And they would say to use his like organizational expertise, right? But it's a little bit more than that. So when we look at Indonesia today, right, we would say that this system while a democracy, because there are elections, was bound by the military, right? The military had a direct role in shaping the institutions or the design of the system, right? Like this system did not emerge from the bottom, where everyone was on kind of a fair playing field, bargaining over what democracy looked like. Instead, the military said, this is what democracy can look like. Anything in these parameters is okay. So why the difference between Indonesia and Paraguay, despite a politically active military for most of its history? So my research points to the strength of these ruling parties, right? So as I had mentioned, the Colorado Party was a very strong political party. It is tied deeply to the communities throughout the country, and it is very popular, right? Like, even though Paraguay is not like developing really fast, and there's a lot of corruption, especially with the Colorado Party, people identify themselves as Coloradoans, right? Which you don't see in a lot of countries. And you compare this to Golkar in Indonesia, where Golkar is weaker, right? Like, it's a party, it can win elections, but it is much weaker. And this affected the military's decision-making when they faced the prospect of democratization, right? So when you got to that point when the military is like, okay, we're going to potentially democratize, what role do we want to take? In Paraguay, the military could say, we can rely on our allies because they are strong, right? We know that the Colorados are going to win elections, they're going to be able to govern, and they are going to be able to protect our interests, right? So we do not need to take a direct role in ruling because civilians can do it for us, right? The military in Indonesia could not make that same strategic decision. When they were facing the prospect of democratization, they were actually having debates within high-ranking officials about whether or not they should take direct control again. I actually talked to people who were in the room trying to debate, do we democratize or do we create a junta, basically? And part of this was a lack of confidence in Golkar, right? They knew that Golkar would be allied to them, but they had no idea if Golkar could win elections on its own, right? And so what they decide to do is they decide to bind democracy. They get to say, all right, sure, we'll accept democracy, but we are going to make it so that our enemies cannot win, right? And that Golkar will perform better than it should be able to do on its own. So they designed a system that protected themselves without having to rely directly on Golkar. And it was only after a couple of elections where they saw that the Islamists and kind of the leftists couldn't win alone that the military was more comfortable moving to a full democracy. And today, most parties that are aligned with the military are kind of these more right-wing nationalist parties that are friendly with the military. And the military, I think at this point, doesn't have to worry about kind of enemies winning power. And so we probably won't see the military ever take power again, but that doesn't mean that the military is fully reliant and confident in these political parties to rule on their behalf. So this is what a lot of my research points to, but it created more questions that I wanted to answer. Specifically, if we get these bounded systems, what happens after that, right? Like, my research initially explains why we get these bounded systems, but we don't know what the impacts of this might be. I think we can look to Chile for some greater insight for this. So anytime I talk about Chile, I have to share this picture. This is Pinochet, and for some reason, military dictators love sunglasses. And this is no exception, but it is quite an intimidating picture. But if you don't know Chile's history, in the 1970s, a communist won elections, Salvador Allende, right? And when he wins his election, obviously the right-wing parties in the country are alarmed by this, and they try several times to remove him through impeachment, but they fail. And after they fail, the military steps in and removes Allende from power through a coup, and he killed himself during that coup. And then Pinochet takes power. And Pinochet was in power for several years, and while in power, he and the military wrote a new constitution, right? And as they were writing this constitution, they kind of learned from experience. They said, okay, right-wing parties in Chile are not strong enough. So what should we do? Inflate their power, right? So they designed elections in a way that made right-wing parties stronger than they were before. And they did this so that these parties could protect them after they left power. And eventually, Pinochet steps down. He lost a referendum asking people, like, can I stay in power? And people are like, no, you can't. And so eventually he steps away from power, and you get this transition to democracy in Chile. And what's interesting about this is a lot of the work in political science looks at Chile, and at this time they're like, you are a full democracy, right? In fact, if we compare you to Sweden, you're almost as democratic as Sweden, right? So this graph is data taken from an organization called the Varieties of Democracy. So they score you on how democratic you are. I don't want to say that Sweden's like a perfect score because it's Swedes grading the score, but obviously they have a certain baseline in mind, right? But anyways, what we can see here is that going into the 1970s, there wasn't a huge gap between Chile and Sweden. You can obviously see where the coup was, right? That just steep drop is where the coup is, and then you get the period of authoritarian rule under the military, and then it democratizes. And VDEM says they fully democratize, right? You're on par with one of the most democratic countries in the world. But when we use a score like this, we are completely missing out on the fact that that system was designed by the military to their benefit, and that it inflated certain factions within society. So the political system is not actually democratic in fully representing all sectors of society, right? But what's interesting is this system has been in place for 30 years, right? So if you are Chilean, right, a huge chunk of your life, whether you are old or young, has been fully lived under this bounded system that was designed for the military, right? So while there is freedom of expression and individual liberties and the rule of law in Chile, we need to think about what are the impacts. What could Chile have looked like if it had been allowed to democratize without the military's interference, right? And we want to understand how durable this is, right? So if any of you are following the news in Chile, they just removed this constitution, right? Just last year. So Pinochet leaves power in 1990 after designing that constitution in the 80s. And so it is 2021 when Chileans finally are able to vote and remove a constitution that was designed by the military. So future research or questions that I have is like, why do some of these bounded arrangements last for 30 years and why are other ones shorter, right? And we have no idea how it affects social development, the development of a civil society, right? Like we think that Chile has this robust civil society, but what could have looked like had the military not constrained the system to look a very specific way, right? What would the economy look like? Would there have been as much economic growth? Would it have been equitable? Would there have been like the same free trade agreements? What different ways, how differently would Chile look today economically if that constitution had not been in effect? And lastly, what would things look like with politics, right? So politics in Chile is a little chaotic. There's a lot of social movements, a lot of large-scale protests, and parties that kind of build off of that, but not a lot of like strong, cohesive parties. Would that still be the case if the military hadn't designed that constitution, right? So these are the future questions that I'm asking and trying to build data for. And it's not just applicable to Chile, right? Another case that comes to mind is Thailand. So if you know Thailand, the military frequently intervenes in politics. And they rule for a few years, but then there's always like this large groundswell of protests by civil society. And they start to have to give up power. But whenever they do so, they design the system themselves, right? But they usually go way more than Pinochet and the Chilean military went, and design systems that ensure that like, military members get to sit in the legislature, right? So imagine Congress in the United States with uniformed officers voting, and how that would look, right? So they purposefully bind democracy in Thailand so much that the military is actually taking a direct role in politics and prevents full democratization there in Thailand. Like I talked about before, you had Myanmar that has this same thing, right? Sudan is going under this same issue right now, where you had these massive protests, people demanding the military step away, and they got the dictator to resign, and you could see the excitement in the people. They were like, oh, we're going to get democracy. But then the military intervened. I was like, no, you're not going to actually get full democracy, right? You're going to get something on our terms. And we want to understand why that is, but also its long-term and short-term effects and how this affects people. So with that, I just want to say thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We now do have time for questions and discussion. If you have a question for Professor Self, just raise your hand. He'll call on you and wait for the microphone to come as well. When you do stand, please just tell us your name and what you're studying or what you do at BYU. Thank you.
So let's start here.
Wait, so I say mine? Okay. Marshall Butler, studying manufacturing engineering, and what was the other thing? Oh, question. Okay. So I'm curious how much research you've done into Myanmar and how over there, part of the conflict is that there's like ethnic minorities and there's ethnic majority group. I'm curious, have you looked into like how maybe racial justifications might play into military dominating over different groups or something?
Yeah. So that is an interesting thing in Myanmar because the Burman are the majority, right? And there's a lot of ethnic conflict with a bunch of groups that are concentrated geographically that are fighting for kind of autonomy. And so the military has been very much involved in those conflicts. And one of their justifications for taking power has been that the civilians can't solve that conflict themselves. But I think what actually freaked them out in this latest turn and led to the coup is that a lot of those parties actually joined with the Burmese majority in their election. So the largest party in Myanmar, instead of things fracturing along ethnic lines, most people voted for that majority party. And it was overwhelmingly in favor of that party, and the military really hates that party. So this is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, if you've heard of her. She won a Nobel Prize in the 1990s, right? So her party won so many seats that there was just no chance for the military to have any influence if they had let her take power, and that's why they conducted the coup. And surprisingly, I think, without regard to the ethnic politics situation there, but right now they are actually now ramping up the conflict against a bunch of those ethnic groups. So they've been quite repressive, and it's been brutal. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Savannah. I'm studying political science. In your research, have you found that different countries or different militaries look to other coups and kind of model them or take examples from them, or are they more isolated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know about a lot of places, but I know in Myanmar, they have studied Thailand. I actually read quotes from Myanmar generals who are like, okay, we messed up by becoming too democratic. We should use the Thai model, right? So they know how to conduct coups well on their own, but where, yeah, some of these militaries make mistakes and learn is through looking at other militaries and how they bind these systems. So definitely the Myanmar military is trying to learn from the Thai military about how to design a political system that looks democratic, but that doesn't endanger their interests. In other regions of the world, I have less expertise, right? I know there was a lot of learning in Latin America between militaries, but in terms of the democratization process, I'm not sure. Thanks. We'll go over here and then back there.
Hi, Rachela Chiriale, and I'm studying psychology. maybe I'm not sure if you're familiar with Venezuela and like the situation that's going on there, but do you see any hope, like like with Chile and the change in like the constitution? Do you think that maybe something similar can happen there?
Yeah, Venezuela is a tough one because some members of the military tried to conduct a coup, but didn't tell other members of the military, which is in doing coups 101, you don't do that, right? Like there are books on how to conduct a coup, and it's usually coordinate. So it's unlikely that the military will be able to play a major role, especially in Venezuela. I have talked to people, Venezuelan experts, and one reason why they expect the military not to play that big a role is because Maduro has paid them all the generals off, right? He's created a lot of high-ranking positions that didn't exist before, and just pays them nice salaries, right? So he can keep the military under his thumb. And then, yeah, I mean, we've seen protests go on for weeks, and there not to be a change there. So for that regime to break down, we would expect it to be like a lot of other regimes, where elites within the regime that Maduro needs to stay in power turn against him, right? And then start fighting amongst themselves, which might happen when like oil wealth plummets and there's not enough money to go around to bribe people, right? But yeah, Venezuela's a tough one. Yeah, back there.
I'm Josh Cherry. I'm in mechanical engineering here at BYU. I was wondering, with a military coup, the military acts very independently, which is a foreign concept to at least us in the United States, because our military is definitely tied to other branches of government. How has the United States kept the military from acting so independently in our history? And if it does start to happen, how can we prevent that?
Right. Okay. So yeah, I have tried to write or think about expanding this model that I had to explain bounded democracy into places where you don't typically see that. And my main argument is one of the reasons why the Paraguayan military relied on the Colorado Party is because they trusted them, right? So these militaries, as long as you trust the people in power, you will not become involved, right? And so the U.S. military has not become overtly political because both parties govern in a way that's acceptable to the military. If one of those parties stops doing that, right, that relationship, that balance starts to break down, right? And we saw this in 2020, where you had more generals become more outspoken. I'm like, actually, we don't like you saying that, right, about a sitting president, which was pretty striking in terms of the norms of professionalization of the U.S. military, right? They usually you don't have four-star generals put out statements reassuring you that they're not going to get involved, right? And so that's, if there is any place to worry, I would say there's not reason to worry, right? But if there is a place to worry, it is if one of the parties becomes more and more radical to the point that they start to govern in a way that is diametrically opposed to the mission of the military. Yeah, we'll go here.
Hi, I'm Emma Brubaker, and I am in tourism studies here at BYU. And I just want to go back to the basics. Is the whole reason why the military gets so involved with the government is not making them happy enough, they're not getting enough money, power? Like, what's the real basic reasons of why?
Yeah, you're kind of hitting the point, right? So in Indonesia, the reason why the military comes into power is because the civilians didn't protect them, like literally did not protect them, right? Like a bunch of them died because the sitting president was kind of playing friendly with the communists, right? And I think this story travels well, right? A lot of work in political science on a lot of the military dictatorships in Latin America in the 1980s and 90s just assumed that these militaries wanted free trade and capitalism, but I would say they were terrified of communists, right? So they were looking in Cuba and Central America. They saw Che, they saw Castro, and these successful revolutions from communist organizations, and they preempted this by taking power, right, to protect themselves. So that does go into the story about their exit from power as well, right? So if you're a military and you take power And over the time that you're in power, if you eliminate your threat and if you build up allies, you're going to feel more comfortable under democracy, right? That's kind of what happens in Indonesia, right? Like they eliminate the communists, so they're not so scared of them, and they build this party that they have some confidence in. But ultimately, the question about whether or not they stay out of politics will depend on how safe they feel. Yeah, I think, yeah, right here.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Hillam. I'm a family history major. So you said that with Chile, we don't know what the social, economic, political development could have been. I'm wondering if in Paraguay you can, since they've become a democracy, have you seen economic growth? Have you seen social growth? Have you seen narrowing of the economic inequality gap?
That's a great question. You just solved the problem that I've had. A little bit, yeah. So Paraguay is kind of hard because it's landlocked and it's mostly agrarian, right? So lots of farms and not a lot of industry. But yes, definitely after democratization, there was improvement in the economy, more representation for unrepresented groups, and more equality generally, yes. But the Colorado Party has made sure that that doesn't get a little too far out of hand, right? Yeah, back there.
I'm Emily Lorenzen. I'm a nursing major, and you may or may not know the answer to this question, so I won't be offended if you don't. But I'm just curious if, as you've done research in these other countries, if you've seen how military rule has affected the healthcare systems there.
Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. I would just, if I had to answer that question, I would just look at kind of how they affect public goods in general. Like, how does it affect education, health, and things like that? I know in Paraguay they have a national health system, but how the military managed that during their period of rule, I have no idea. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I'm Kara. I'm an English major, and I was just wondering if you could give us like a sneak peek. I know maybe you can't share a lot, or like you don't have a lot of research, but into what the research you are doing and sort of those effects that you're seeing that it has.
Yeah, so it's actually very early stage. So I have a team of RAs that are going through every single democratic transition since World War II, because my initial project only focused on the military. And I want to look at all regimes, right? So when I would present this, some people would be like, hey, this is a great concept, this bounded democratization. What happens if it's a party in power, right? Or what happens if it's an individual dictator in power and they bind the system? What does that look like? So we're starting to collect data on that. And it's interesting to see how, when the USSR fails, how this looks differently in Eastern Europe, right? Where you have strong communist parties trying to design their system on their own. Yeah, but in terms of the findings, I have no idea, right? I am completely, I'm excited to learn what that is, but that's years away. Yeah, we'll go back here in the back row.
I'm Bruno Tanner, a mechanical engineering major. I kind of have two questions. You can answer either and either. So we know that there was heavy U.S. involvement in a lot of the coups in South America. I'm wondering how important that involvement was in making those occur. And then the other question is, since we have been so involved in coups to give militaries power, is there a role for the U.S. in helping these other nations democratize, in your thoughts?
Yeah. So the U.S. was definitely involved in some of the coups, and then later involved in the repression. But I'm always cautious, really cautious with this, because the CIA consulting you on a coup does not mean that the U.S. caused it to happen, right? Definitely these militaries took the initiative and wanted to do it themselves. But what I noticed with U.S. foreign policy is they just care if you democratize. They don't care about the details of it, right? So this is what struck me about Indonesia, is the U.S. was involved, right? Things were getting out of hand, and the U.S. tried to pressure the military, like, hey, you should probably allow democracy to happen, right? But once you start saying like, oh, we're doing free and fair elections, they don't really care if the military is actually involved in setting up the electoral system, right? And so, yeah, I would think that this is a blind spot for U.S. foreign policy that I can help fix. Yeah.
Okay, my name's Hunter Kerr. I'm studying social science teaching in Arabic here at BYU. I have a question specific about Sudan. In
Yeah.
the last few years, there's been like 3 or 4 coups. And just last month, the military leader who's been in charge, Burhan, just declared that he pledged that he would transition in 2 years to an electoral system. And I'm wondering if, in your opinion, if that will work, if it'll be successful, or what would need to happen for democracy to take place in Sudan?
Yeah, so my research is going to predict that it's not going to be a full democracy, that it's going to be a democracy with conditions, right? So my understanding of Sudan is you had those large-scale protests. The military stepped in to remove al-Bashir, right? And after he was gone, initially they kind of said like, yeah, sure, we'll stabilize things and then we'll start working on a democracy. But they kept on slow walking it, right? And then they created a council like with some flowery name about transition and justice, I'm sure. But 50% of the council is military, right? And 50% of the council is like opposition and civil leaders and stuff like that. And it seems like it's not going well, because the last I had heard about it is they had threatened to dissolve the council, right? So there's still protests. Obviously, there's demand from society for that democracy, but the military does not have an ally, and I think that's the main sticking point, right? How do you design a democracy in Sudan that doesn't result in your opposition completely taking over power and then eliminating or completely tearing down the military and starting from scratch? And I think that's what the calculations that the military is facing right now, and why we probably won't see a real democracy there, yeah.
My name is Kachati. I'm doing international relations here at BYU. But I'm originally from Thailand in the refugee camps, and my parents are from Burma, fleeing that war. So I'm seeing all this news and all that stuff. I actually went back to the conflict zone myself, but it seems as though the political parties of the Karen ethnic, at least, they've been aligned to the NLD party just because they think they're easier to deal with. If they win, then it'll be easier to deal with the party than the military.
Yeah.
But however, we still foresee bloodshed based on ethnic lines, because there's nothing in the party's doctrine or whatever to guarantee freedom to, just to be a different ethnic, really. So like, I guess my question to you is like, what do you foresee in the current situation right now? There's like constant fighting. Where do you see the Burmese military in the next 10 years? Are they able to sustain themselves? Because the general is kind of like putting all his eggs in one basket right now in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, it's going to look like it has for the past 60, 70, 80 years.
Just continue?
Yeah, like I imagine the military is going to stay in power, repress ethnic minorities like they've had, and try to design a system that looks democratic but is not.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So how do we prevent that?
How do you prevent that?
Yeah.
Huh.
Well, I guess like right now it's a direct challenge. To directly challenge it is just bloodshed.
Well, so yeah, so this is the grim reality of military rule, right? Is you need a force stronger than the military. So, I mean, maybe if all the ethnic nationalist movements bounded together and formed an alliance to fight the military, they might stand a chance, but I doubt it, right? Because the Tatmadaw is allied with Russia and they're supplied with Russian arms, so.
And Israel.
Yeah. This is the last question. Okay.
Yay, can I sneak one in?
Yeah.
Well, what about splits in the military, though? I mean, because not all militaries are unified. And so sometimes you don't need a force stronger than a military. You just need a force stronger than part of the military, and it might be the other part of the military.
Yeah, that's definitely true, right? Often military rule fails when there's a split in the military. And then what remains to be seen is, does the military just give up power to try to keep itself together, or does it break out? And the reason why I actually ignore those militaries is because that results in civil war, right? Or a cycle of coups. It does not. A military that divided cannot guide a democratic transition. So that's kind of outside the scope of my research. But yes, I guess, I mean, he just left. So I said the other straw of hope that you can hold on to is that the military that has not fought against itself at all ever eventually does so.
All right. Please join me once again in thanking Professor Self for this.